Dr. Perry didn't see a broken brain, he saw a neglected one. Was this really brain damage? Or was this what happens when a child is raised like a dog? For the first time, he was surrounded by what he had lacked for years: love, presence, and safety. And the difference between developing a disorder or not often comes down to one thing: your environment. Even tiny shifts can start rewiring your brain's safety signals. Welcome to Reflections and Realizations. I'm Alveena. I write, I read, I reflect, and I believe. So, this podcast is my diary out loud. I'll share what I'm learning, what I felt, and the connections I'm gathering from life, psychology, and faith as a way of making sense of it all. And I'm inviting you along on the journey to reflect, to feel, and maybe recognize parts of yourself that you didn't notice before. Now, this isn't my story, but a story that made me reflect on the impact of our environments. So, Justin was just a toddler when he was locked in a cage. He was raised amongst the smell of filth and the sound of barking. In his early years, he wasn't hugged, held, or rocked to sleep. He was barked at, sometimes hit, and often left alone with the dogs. Because his caregiver, an older man named Arthur, he didn't know how to raise a child. He only knew how to raise dogs. So he fed Justin, he changed his nappies, but there was no play, no comfort, no conversation or affection. Before Justin was 6, doctors had diagnosed him with permanent brain damage. But no one asked how he was being raised. No one looked into his environment. And it wasn't until age 6, when he was brought in for pneumonia, that Dr. Perry, a child psychiatrist, finally wondered, was this really brain damage? Or was this what happens when a child is raised like a dog? So, even though doctors had diagnosed Justin with permanent and severe brain damage, Dr. Perry didn't see a broken brain. He saw a neglected one. He wondered, maybe Justin didn't speak because he had rarely been spoken to. Maybe he didn't walk because no one had held out their hand to encourage him, and maybe he couldn't use a knife and fork because no one had ever shown him how to do so. So instead of pills or surgery, Dr. Perry prescribed something else: a safe environment, which meant regular meals, a consistent bedtime routine, one where he wasn't pushed or disciplined. He was met with calm, steady adults who simply sat with him. They made eye contact. They didn't demand that he act normal. And within a week, Justin was sitting in a chair and he could stand with assistance. By 2 weeks, he had taken his first steps. And after 3 weeks, he was ready to move with a foster family. So his progress was astonishing because for the first time, he was surrounded by what he had lacked for years: love, presence, and safety. So, Dr. Perry, in his book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, explains that the absence of nurturing care creates what he calls relational poverty, which is a lack of safe, stable relationships in early childhood. And relational poverty was at the core of Justin's trauma. And this has nothing to do with material wealth. A child can grow up in a mansion and still be relationally starved if they don't experience consistent love, presence, or emotional regulation. So, earlier this year, that insight made me reflect on the early years of the Prophet of Islam. So, it was a story I had always heard, framed around loss, which is that he lost his father before birth, his mother by the age of 6, and then his grandfather shortly after. And at first glance, it seemed like a story of deprivation. But when I looked closer, I realized that there was love everywhere. There was relational wealth because amongst loss, the Prophet of Islam was surrounded by love, by care, with care, and he was always in a stable environment. Because before he was born, a compassionate family helper supported his mother. She comforted her through her grief of losing her husband during her pregnancy by sharing stories that helped preserve her well being. And then after birth, multiple caregivers nurtured him. There was Thuwaiba, who nursed him in the early days of his life, his mother, Amina, Halima, his foster mother, and then Fatima, who welcomed him into her home after his grandfather passed away. And each woman showed up with him with love, with presence, with care, and from them he learned what every child needs, what it feels like to be safe, to trust, and to truly belong. So here's what it comes down to. What really shapes a child isn't the house they live in or the status they're born into. It's whether they had people who showed up for them consistently and with love. And that's what builds resilience, empathy, and the kind of trust that makes secure relationships possible later in life. And psychology backs this up. So there's a model called the diathesis stress model, which basically says we all come into the world with certain susceptibilities. However, it's the environment we grow up in that decides whether those susceptibilities ever turn into real struggles. For example, some of us may carry stronger genetic wiring for depression, anxiety, or even schizophrenia, but those traits often stay dormant unless life brings the kind of stress or trauma that activates them. So, in other words, just because you have a susceptibility or just because you have a genetic wiring, it doesn't mean that it has to play out in real life. And the difference between developing a disorder or not often comes down to one thing: your environment. And one of the most important studies in this area looked at adopted children whose biological parents had schizophrenia. And research has found that if those children were raised in calm, supportive, and emotionally regulated homes, they often never developed the illness. But in households that were loud, chaotic, or emotionally unpredictable, the risk of schizophrenia skyrocketed. So it wasn't the genes alone. Again, it was the emotional environment that flipped the switch. So I remember a time when my own environment turned toxic and it felt unsafe. My brain wouldn't switch off. I couldn't sleep properly. My appetite disappeared. I even became withdrawn. I broke out in hives. And then, unsurprisingly, when I removed myself from that environment, my symptoms disappeared. So today, knowing what I know about the brain, the nervous system, and our environments, I've become fiercely protective over my children's world, their physical space, their friendships, the tone in our home, the energy I bring into a room. And I'm back in therapy again. Not because I'm struggling with anything personal. In fact, I went to refer my kids. I sat across from the therapist thinking I was there to get them some help. But my therapist, he didn't even want to see them because he knew that working with me meant working with them. He knew what I hadn't fully realized then, which is the emotional tone of the home, emotional regulation, basically starts with me. Because in the Bowen's family systems theory, it's not about blaming children for not knowing how to regulate. It's about recognizing that children don't learn emotional regulation through lectures or discipline. As Bowen puts it, you don't teach emotional regulation. You create the conditions where regulation is possible. So it's kind of insane when I think about it. Like, I walked into that room ready to put my children in the chair. But once again, I learned what I should have already known, that just like Justin, the child isn't the problem. The child doesn't need fixing. It's the environment that needs to change. And as their parent, that environment starts with me. So here's where I bring it back to you. How is your environment looking like right now? Not just your home, but your workspace, your friendships, and maybe even your social media. Ask yourself, do you feel constantly drained after certain conversations? Is someone always trauma dumping on you? Or if we're being real, are you the one offloading without boundaries? Are you surrounded by tension, passive aggression, and negativity? Or maybe you're the one bringing that in. Because sometimes we talk about toxic people like it's always them. But what if it's the system we're all in? What if it's us? What if we're unknowingly adding to the toxicity? So the key is to be honest about what's really going on so you know what needs to change. And to make sense of this, I've created a simple 2 step journaling tool I call the scan and shift framework. So, what you do is step one, scan, look around, notice how you feel in different spaces and with different people. Do you feel safe? Is your nervous system calm or on edge? Do you leave this environment feeling drained or energized? And be honest, your body will tell you the truth before your mind catches up. And step two, shift. If you spot an unhealthy environment for yourself or your loved ones, what small change can you make today? Can you set a boundary? Can you step away from a draining relationship? Or can you remove yourself from a space to protect your peace? Because even tiny shifts can start rewiring your brain's safety signals. I mean, take Justin, for example, the boy who was raised like a dog. A few years after living with his foster family, a letter arrived at Dr. Perry's office, and inside was a photo of Justin. He was holding a lunchbox, he was wearing a backpack, and he was standing next to a yellow school bus. On the back of this picture, in crayon, he had written, "Thank you, Dr. Perry." And Dr. Perry cried when he read it because just in a few years, a boy who had been locked in a kennel and diagnosed with permanent brain damage had become a child ready for school. So, Justin's story shows us that trauma can be reversed, brains can rewire, and that love, safety, and predictable routines can actually be medicine. Thank you for listening to Reflections and Realizations, and I'll see you in the next episode.